BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday, another Dahlia Thursday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Thursdays, I talk to you guys about the Black Dahlia Murder, one of the most horrific crimes in American history. And in this episode, I will be discussing the book Severed by John Gilmore, one of the most groundbreaking books that has been written about the case. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Black Dahlia. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, to those of you who have been following this segment, Dahlia Thursday, you might remember that I said that I had started the book Black Dahlia Red Rose by Pew Eatwell, and I'm not going to lie to you guys, I'm still working on that one here and there, but if I can make an honest confession, that book is unbelievably boring, and I guess there are certain pieces of information that I'm looking for and certain expectations that I had about that book, Black Dahlia Red Rose, and it almost feels like the writer is just not getting to the point, because it's my understanding that Black Dahlia Red Rose is going to explore Leslie Dillon as a suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947, and there's a lot of build-up, there's a lot of backstory, there are some pieces of information and commentary that I genuinely do appreciate, but a lot of it just seems like things are drawn out and stretched to the point of an unbearable nature. So what I wanted to do was, I wanted to go to one of the source materials for a lot of people, and that is Severed by John Gilmore. Severed is a book that is reported to have been the first full-length book that was written about the Black Dahlia case, and that really is quite shocking, because this one came out nearly 50 years after Elizabeth Short was murdered, and of course people reported on the Black Dahlia case before, but the first full-length book that has been dedicated solely to the Black Dahlia murder is Severed by John Gilmore. And as you can see from the title of this episode, this is going to be a prelude, where I'm going to look at some of the introductory materials and share them with you. Bear in mind that these are free resources that have been put online, and then I'll have a response to that. The first thing is an introduction that has been written by John Gilmore, and that says, "The Black Dahlia Murder is an impenetrable mystery that can never be solved. A stone-cold case, the Christmas following the murder of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. Her violent death remains an unsolvable mystery. There is no investigative information or recently released district attorney files that shed a single shred of light towards bringing a suspect to justice, or that exposes some cover-up or disastrous police corruption. Nothing supports a connection between any such suspect and the murder of Elizabeth Short." And when I was reading that, I was really reminded of a lot of the true crime cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, such as the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, D.B. Cooper, the disappearance of Maura Murray. And in a lot of these high-profile unsolved mysteries, a lot of people believe that they will not be solved, or that they cannot be solved. And I've talked to a lot of researchers and sleuths who follow these cases, and they often ask the question amongst ourselves, and they say, what are we doing? Why are we looking at these cases where we might never get to know the truth? And some people genuinely step away from the mystery at a certain point. Other people keep going, and they view it as an opportunity to explore crime history, as well as other subjects, such as in the D.B. Cooper case. A lot of things are aviation related, and in the Black Dahlia case, a lot of things are connected to the history of Los Angeles and even Hollywood and how that functioned. So there are things that we can learn along the way, but with some of the cases that I just mentioned, such as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Maura Murray, and even the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, those cases started much earlier on. Those incidents happened much earlier on in terms of a contemporary status. So I think that those three cases can be solved. We have much more evidence in the JonBenet Ramsey case, and with the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, that happened in 2007. So really, really a very different time frame than the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947. But what do you really think about this? Do you think that it's worth exploring an unsolved mystery if we will never truly get the answer? And I think a lot of you are perhaps still going to go down the rabbit hole, because I know that a lot of listeners to this program also follow my segment Ripper Wednesday on Black Box Online Radio, which talks about Jack the Ripper, and that's going to be the hardest case to solve out of all of the ones that I've mentioned, but I would really love to know your response. Now, as I said, I'm going to keep going with John Gilmore's book, and I'm going to share a segment of it with you, and then let's have a response. The photographer's flash bulb popped in quick succession until Lieutenant Jess Haskins arrived and asked the uniformed officers to keep everyone temporarily off the sidewalk. He told Fitzgerald and Perkins and the lab crew was on their way, and that they needed to call 2 other detectives. "Nobody in town is going to print any of the pictures of this one," Underwood said to Haskins. "This is the worst one I've ever seen, Jess." They didn't leave much to anyone's imagination at the time. The detective said, "I don't know if it's they or a he or a she, but I'll let you know as soon as I do." Haskins looked at her as she leaned against the right door of the coupe squad car that was blocking her view of the lot. She then stood very stiffly with her back against the car, clutching her purse and notebook pad against her stomach, and said, "What the hell kind of business are we in anyway?" The only possible evidence was quickly apparent to Haskins, and that was a cement sack bearing spots of watery blood. Another blood spot on the sidewalk was found by Fitzgerald, and a heel print in the driveway. The print was apparently made by a heel, having stepped in a small spot of blood, but the print was partly obscured by the track of the automobile tire. The body was cold, and from the marks on her neck, the immediate cause of death seemed to be strangulation, not manually, but by rope. It seemed to him that the body may have been soaked in water and washed, so that the latent prints or other evidence would have been removed. The body had probably been drained of blood. Apart from one of the blood spots, the heel print, and the cement sack, nothing else was found. It was the kind of homicide that could get the department and the press in a wrangle. Haskins believed. The naked body told him that a sex crime had been committed, not just the dismemberment or an axe murder, though those were rough enough, but there was something here that went beyond the unnatural and the peculiar. He felt that the law was facing a defiance killing, a sex crime, but with other dimensions. The killer had set his handiwork on their doorsteps in a manner that not only challenged them, but was an act of defiance against everything that was human. If they weren't on their toes and didn't nab this guy pronto, they'd be in one hell of a tussle with the papers, and the radio, and a mess like a pressure cooker that was about to blow up. The body had a cleanliness, or a fresh look, that Haskins noted, but it was arranged and spread out in what he described as someone's idea of a dirty postcard that suddenly materializes into real life. It was not unusual, the display idea, as part of a sex crime, but Aggie Underwood's comment that they hadn't tried to hide very much kept coming back to Haskins. Hiding it had been the least of the perpetrator's concerns. Something didn't gel. Something was cockeyed. It was only surprising to Haskins that the body hadn't been discovered sooner. Anyone passing the location should have noticed it, like a billboard. He felt that it would have taken a police psychiatrist to figure out this murder. Compiling the reports from Perkins and Fitzgerald with his own appraisal of the scene, Haskins drove to the nearest payphone on Crenshaw and called Captain Jack Donahoe at Central Homicide. The detective had no way of anticipating the police rivalries and problems that would soon arise, but he'd confess at first that a reluctance to hand over the case to Central was stressing out the need for a maximum canvassing of the surrounding neighborhood. He told Donahoe it was unlikely that the bisection had occurred far from where the body was found. "There's some kind of deliberate arrangement of all this," Haskins told Donahoe, "and with all these particular cuts and peculiar ones, they're carefully done. She hasn't been hacked up, and even the cut straight through the middle had been done with some sort of skill. The guy could have been a doctor or someone with medical knowledge. Hard to tell how much of this was done to her while she was still alive, because the body's been so cleaned off, and from what I can tell until the coroner gets here, there's no blood in her to give us any lividity. Looks like strangulation, but seems like she was trussed up by ropes, and maybe wire, from some of the marks, and maybe some of the spread eagle bounds. Upside down, the way you'd hang a carcass, the way that she could have been drained to let the blood out. It's almost the worst I've seen, Jack. And I think this nut's probably lining up another one right now. Jack Donahoe put through a call to Detective Sergeant Harry Hansen, the senior officer and supervisor, most murder investigations in Los Angeles and in the metropolitan area. Hansen had been with the police force since 1926, and after assignment to the Homicide Division, he had written a police handbook on the preservation of evidence and the protection of the crime scenes. He was closing another case with his partner, Phineas Brown, in southwest Los Angeles, where the coroner was also needed. Over the radio, Donahoe told Hansen, "The university's got a bad one here. Harry, a girl was cut in half, right down the middle, and in a vacant lot. Stark naked, and there's already photographs on it. It looks like there might be problems. Get a uniformed officer to stand by where you are, and you and Brown get over to 39th and Norton." Again, Donahoe said, "It looks like a bad one, Harry." By the time Hansen and Brown reached the new location, reporters from the LA newspapers had converged upon the area, littering the street and sidewalk with cigarette butts and the blackened flashbulbs from cameras. Several more police officers and onlookers had found their way to the site. Some were driving around the block while others had parked and stood on the roofs of their cars for a better view. Hansen was bothered from the start. A murder scene had its own special kind of life for a detective, its own signature. Even though the girl had been murdered elsewhere and the body had been brought to the lot, the spot where she was found was a sacred setting, as Hansen called it. Time and circumstances could be read from even the most seemingly insignificant piece of evidence. Elements that could shed light not only on the victim, but on the murderer. The success of closing a case could be jeopardized from the start by a bunch of curiosity seekers, hungry for the gory details. Homicide is a union that never dies, Hansen would say, a bond that is formed and binds two subjects in a set of circumstances. They're tighter than a marriage and a wedding, tied together into infinity. Nobody needs it, busted up from the outside. That's why it's sacred, because it's on the ground that they've walked on only once and it's never crossed again. You can get married 3 times to the same individual, but you can only kill them once, and it's an irreversible act. It can never be changed, and the circumstance altered. And where it's taken place or where you find the body is damn near the same thing, because they were both there, the one that's dead and the one that's alive. Even when we catch the living one and hopefully put them to death, there is still that union that tied them together, and it's still irreversible. It's as irreversible as the very second that it happened. None of the clues could be separated from the scene as a whole without disrupting the total picture, Hansen said. Every shred of evidence bore a signature, especially in the placement of the corpse. In facsimile, the scene would unfold for a true detective as a kind of work of art, a reflection of a mind and personality, the traits of a killer as well as those of the victim. Lives peculiar to certain circumstances that could be mirrored in even the most remote clue. The evidence had to be protected as a whole, or the signature would become diffused, then fade, and be gone. Several plainclothes and uniformed officers were stepping carefully through the weeds farther into the field. "We're going over to the ground now," Haskins told them. "And if anything turns up, we'll have it for the lab crew. They're on their way." Hansen said that it looked as though everyone had gone over the ground, and perhaps there wouldn't be much left for the lab. "Call Ray Pinker," Hansen said. "Get him over here." Squatting down on the edge of the sidewalk, he stared at the dead girl's face for just a moment. His usual, stone-solid objectivity from 20 years of police work seemed to slip a little, according to Brown. Okay, now this is some powerful stuff, and I must say that Severed seems to be a book that we can explore much more easily than Black Dahlia Red Rose. I don't know about you guys, but just reading off this chapter right now, this sounds like a very, very engaging and very, very captivating narrative. But as all of you know, just because a narrative is captivating in the true crime world does not mean that it's accurate. And John Gilmore has been heavily criticized for his book Severed, for fudging the facts in certain areas, for taking certain creative liberties with his book. But just to talk about what's in that chapter of Severed that you just heard. Firstly, what's the physical evidence? What can be used to solve the Black Dahlia case? And it doesn't really appear that there is a whole lot. Elizabeth Short's body was scrubbed, her body was cleaned, someone was relatively aware that fingerprints could be found on the body, so this should suggest somebody that has an understanding of forensics, an understanding of medical examinations, and I really don't think that this is something that the average, ordinary, Joe Sixpack, average Joe type would be thinking about, that fingerprints can be left on human skin during an autopsy. This also suggests that the person had medical knowledge, and we're dealing with someone who might be a medical doctor as opposed to a butcher or an undertaker or maybe a traveling salesman that sold plumbing supplies. Also, we have a bloody drop of water, we have blood on the sidewalk, and that heel print sounds very valuable. Now, you guys might not like hearing this, but one of my responses is that the heel print probably would have been much more critical to the investigations in 1947. In 2025, at the time of this recording, I think that that's a little bit more questionable because, alright, so somebody stepped in the blood and they left a heel print. You match that to their shoes, then they're going on trial. They're going to be arrested, and at the very least, that is physical evidence that could connect them to the crime scene. Now, that doesn't mean for a second that you're going to get a guilty conviction based on that alone, but that actually would be a piece of physical evidence that would connect somebody to the crime scene. And in 2025, we're dealing with 60 years later, almost, not quite. This is something that is going to be a little bit less valuable when it comes to solving the case. But you guys also might be thinking about some things. I've already talked about fingerprints, also DNA. So much of that just seems to have been lost. And even if they still had some type of blood sample from this watery blood that was found in the cement sack, then that also is not very helpful because it was probably contaminated so easily. You just heard that in John Gilmore's own words, that this is something where people were trampling the crime scene. I mean, in countless cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, in the Zodiac Killer mystery and the pre-canonical crimes, people trample the crime scenes and they destroy the evidence, especially in the case of the Swindle murders from 1964, a possible Zodiac crime. So that is not looking good for actually bringing some type of resolution. But think about everything that we've said so far in this chapter from John Gilmore in his book Severed. Think about everything that we've heard. Firstly, maybe the killer was a doctor. Maybe the killer lived in the area. The authorities are sounding very confident when they're saying that, well, it seems like this is somebody who was in the vicinity of the area and there wasn't a very large distance between where Elizabeth Short was murdered and the dump site. Who does that sound like? The suspect that I've been talking to you guys about almost every single week since Dahlia Thursday started, Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey, a 66-year-old medical doctor who had a house in the relative vicinity of the crime scene. And he looks like a stronger and stronger suspect. And also at 66 years old, is it possible that they just simply did not suspect that a man of that age would be capable of committing the crimes? And furthermore, I am also glad that John Gilmore points out that there is something that is horribly, horribly suspicious about the disposal. That how this crime occurred, and somebody brought Elizabeth Short's body to the dump site, and nobody witnessed it. I mean, that is another thing that I think is just mind-blowing. Nobody saw a vehicle stop, and somebody was pulling out these cement bags and doing something. Goodness, when you're in the Los Angeles area at any time of day, at any time of night, shouldn't there have been some witnesses? And I know the person's waiting for no one to be around, but how on earth can you stop passerbys in a metropolitan area? So that's also very skeptical. I mean, like, it's very suspicious. Was the killer just in a home nearby, and is he just kind of driving up and down and has an easy access point and can see when no one is around and he's making an estimation? Is that what happened? All right, so if we can make the expectation that the killer lived in the vicinity or had a house or property in the vicinity, that might narrow the search for a future episode of Dahlia Thursday. But I can also ask you that as a challenge question. Does anything that you heard in that chapter by John Gilmore from his book Severed suggest to you that the killer lived in the vicinity? And furthermore, there are some things that the detectives are talking about in the book here that really sound more on the emotional side of these matters. Perhaps I should have said psychological rather than emotional. That the killer seems like he's a budding serial killer. And to the best of our knowledge, 58 years later, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that the Black Dahlia Avenger actually murdered another person. I can give you countless theories. I can tell you the names of countless suspects who get accused of multiple crimes, the Zodiac Killer and the Black Dahlia Killer. But in terms of actually identifying the Black Dahlia Avenger's second murder, I'm not completely convinced. But in terms of what you heard there, they're like, this guy's probably looking for his next victim. I would have thought that, and I think that's a totally reasonable observation. Next challenge question. Why didn't the Black Dahlia Avenger commit another murder? I would really love to know your response to that. You can put your idea in the comment section down below. And I'm also going to just ask you guys a couple of other things. And that is, what do you think about that statement that there was a type of relationship that gets formed with the killer? That you can murder somebody once and that killer feels like he has dominated this person almost in like a wedding, in matrimony, to the point where no one will ever be able to do that again. I now have power over this victim forever. And I think all of the detectives were completely spot on that. Everything you heard in that John Gilmore section was just that they're like, okay, this person wanted to dominate Elizabeth Short. He wanted power over her, and he wanted to send a message to the Los Angeles area that I did this. I don't want to get caught, but I did this, and I had control over her. I killed this woman. I bragged about it, and nobody will ever get to do that again. Very twisted and deranged and demented thinking. But what do you think about any of that? And furthermore, I would like to thank John Gilmore for his book, Severed here. One more time, I was reading a free chapter that had been placed online, Severed, the True Story of the Black Dahlia. And I also want to be clear that I'm not giving up on Black Dahlia Red Rose, because that was one of the first books that was recommended to me. Okay, let's be honest, that was the first book that was recommended to me solely about the Black Dahlia case. Of course, Steve Odell actually wrote in the comments section once here on Black Box Online Radio, and he said that I should read Black Dahlia Avenger. So those are the first books that were put on my list and my radar. But with Black Dahlia Red Rose, that's a book that I've wanted to read for about 3 years. No point in giving up on it now. But I would also like to know what you guys think about the book Severed by John Gilmore. And from my early explorations into the Black Dahlia case here on Dahlia Thursday, I think that Severed is perhaps one of the top two most famous books. Really, it would be Severed or Black Dahlia Avenger in terms of rivaling popularity. Black Dahlia Avenger by Steve Odell might be more famous, but Severed seems to be the go-to book that people are looking at when they want to get an introductory material. And I really insist on, like, when I'm reading that free chapter, it sounds engaging. You want to know what happens next. It's getting your attention the whole time. You want to hear about the details. You want to hear about the evidence. And I really think that there's something that is defendable about that, even if we are going to challenge certain issues later on. But one thing I've also noticed about you guys in the Black Box Online Radio audience, the Black Box Battalion, if you will, is that you guys want to hear about the hard evidence. You really want to hear discussions on how the evidence can be analyzed. And I also confess that sometimes I get curious about stories, and sometimes I get curious about, ideas that are connected to the cases, but not relevant to the evidence. And you guys often say, hey, this really doesn't help solve the case. Well, when I'm in the audience, I have that experience as well. As a case in point, look at Black Dahlia Red Rose. That is a book that is just filled with stories and connecting the dots, and there's a lot of build up, and this person said hello to that person. I'm like, all right, just get to the point, focus on the Black Dahlia. This is not a book that I was expecting to read about hello, how are you? This is a book that I was expecting to read about Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia murder, the investigation, and getting to the suspect that is going to be identified. With Black Dahlia Red Rose, it should be Leslie Dillon. And I've already done an episode on this channel about Gilmore's suspect, Jack Anderson Wilson, whom I think is one of the most ridiculous suspects ever proposed. And to be clear, Gilmore presented him as an informant, and then he became an informant turned suspect, but I absolutely do not think that he murdered Elizabeth Short. I have a standalone episode about him that I invite you to listen to here on this channel. And also, to those of you who have followed the Black Dahlia case more than I have, I've done this for 2 months. I am a newcomer. I'm just starting out. So, for those of you who have followed the Black Dahlia case more than I have, what do you recommend? Like, do you recommend a book? Do you recommend going straight to the FBI files? Do you recommend newspapers.com? And yes, on Dahlia Thursday, we're going to do all of it. So please drop your ideas in the comment section down below, recommend anything that you would like, and maybe it will be worked into a future episode of Dahlia Thursday here on BBOR. And I am also going to keep going with John Gilmore's book because I find it to be absolutely enthralling. But please look out for new episodes every Thursday about the Black Dahlia, as well as about the other cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, the Zodiac Killer, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday on Facebook, Instagram, and here on YouTube. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. My Instagram name is blackboxonlineradio. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And you can download this program for free on Spotify under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast, and the images that you have seen from this program are archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook. So, lots of places to explore content. And that will be all for me now, and I'll see you tomorrow for an episode about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.